Hello, and welcome to an overview of the CARE process, specifically designed to help volunteer supporters understand and see an overview of an individual's journey through the CARE Act. The goal of this training is to help volunteer supporters feel prepared as they begin to support someone through the CARE process. So, first, we will provide a high level overview of what the CARE Act is and what the goals are. And then we'll introduce some major roles in the CARE Act, including the respondent or the individual going through the CARE process, the petitioner, a volunteer supporter, the county behavioral health agency, housing and community supports, and judicial and legal participants. The third section will focus on walking through what you can expect through the CARE Act civil court process, knowing that individual cases may proceed a little differently depending on the needs of the individual. The goal of today's session is that you will have an increased ability to describe the why behind the CARE Act, distinguish key roles within the CARE process, and describe the overall legal process within the CARE Act. So first, let's go over that high-level overview. So the CARE Act at a glance. The CARE Act creates a new pathway to deliver mental health and substance use disorder services to a subset of Californians with the most complex behavioral health conditions, who too often suffer in homelessness or incarceration without treatment. The CARE Act is more than just a process, though. It's a way to connect individuals to services in their communities. There are many paths in, and there are individualized paths out. Each path begins when someone files a petition, which means that the petitioner believes that someone is eligible and would benefit from additional support. In this process, that individual is referred to as the respondent or the person being connected to services. The goal is to give personalized support that someone would benefit from. So, what does that court process look like? The CARE Act court process can take several pathways through the civil court. Shown here is a general overview of the process, and we are highlighting steps most relevant to the supporter role. We want to highlight that later in this presentation, we will be exploring details of this process through the lens of a potential CARE participant, Michael. It's broken into three major phases. The process begins with the petitioner initiating the case. The assessment and engagement follows with the county behavioral health. Then the case continues to the court process and connection to services. From there, those who've engaged in a care agreement or a care plan, there's ongoing service delivery. Finally, there is a potential graduation from the CARE Act or assessing for next steps. During the court process or service connection phase, the role of the supporter really comes to play at or before the initial appearance. Before that point, during the case initiation and engagement, there are different types of people who can file the initial petition, and that can impact how the court process flows until the supporter comes into the process. Two of the paths include a voluntary care agreement or a court-ordered care plan. These can include treatment, including medications, and psychosocial interventions, housing support, and other supportive services. So let's take a look at an overview of the primary roles in the care process. These are the primary roles: the client, also known as the respondent, the petitioner, the volunteer supporter, the county behavioral health or BH agency, the housing and community support providers, and of course, the care court and the roles within that court. The first role for us to discuss is the client or respondent. Keep in mind that the word respondent is a legal term, refers to the person participating in the care process. This slide gives a summary of the eligibility criteria for folks who may access the care process. You can look at more detailed information in the CARE Act eligibility criteria brief and the eligibility and practice training materials. Let's talk about who can file a petition, and you may be familiar with this list. Petitioners can include a group of lay individuals, which could be a family member, a roommate, or housemate, or the client and respondent themselves. The petitioner can also come from a number of system partners, which could include a first responder or homeless outreach worker who has repeated contact with the individual, licensed behavioral health professional involved in their treatment, a public guardian or conservator, or the director of a number of organizations or programs. It could also include the judge of a California tribal court. Note that for many of these individuals, this could include their designee. Now let's take a look at a volunteer supporter. So a volunteer supporter role is a person who is identified by the client and respects the client's preferences, goals, values, and beliefs. This is a person that supports the individual's autonomy, independence, and decision-making authority over their own life. This person may be a part of the care agreement or the care plan to support the follow-through and access to additional services. There's training and technical assistance regarding the volunteer supporter role. For more information, you can visit the supporter role in the CARE Act brief and other CARE Act training materials on the CARE Act Resource Center. So the County Behavioral Health Agency is assigned to engage with the client as they enter into different pathways of a care agreement or care plan. The County Behavioral Health Agency will likely engage their assertive community treatment or ACT teams or a similar wraparound outreach team such as the Full Service Partnership or FSP. County behavioral health agencies and their teams will look different, but regardless, they are a key player in providing outreach, creating an initial report, conducting the clinical evaluation, engaging the client in the mental health treatment, and connecting that individual with other supports and services, such as housing. Examples of a BH provider team could include a team lead or program manager or supervisor, a licensed or waivered clinicians, which could include a social worker or a psychologist, a psychiatrist, case managers, including substance use disorder specialists, housing specialists, employment specialists, or medical caseworkers, occupational therapists, peer support or community health workers, and nurses. For more information, you can visit the CARE Act fact sheet. This is a snapshot of the different potential types of housing that the care client or respondent may have access to or be prioritized for. Different community-based housing models will look different by county. Examples of housing providers include permanent supportive housing, affordable housing, interim transitional housing, and behavioral health bridge housing. Examples of community supports providers may offer social services funded through supplemental security income or state supplementary payment, financial assistance for immigrants, CalWORKS, California Food Assistance Program, in-home supportive housing services programs, and CalFresh. If you look at Code or WIC 5982, there's a multitude of housing programs, funding sources, and other community services that are highlighted as priorities for access for this particular CARE Act population. Let's take a look at some judicial and legal roles. Since this is a legal process, there are legal components. There will always be representation, usually by county counsel or another agency for behavioral health. The respondent has the right to court-appointed counsel regardless of their ability to pay. This will be either legal aid or a public defender, depending on the county and the availability. The role of the respondent's counsel is to represent the respondent's interests and to protect their due process rights. Respondents can hire a private attorney if they are able. There is also a judge who will be a neutral arbiter. Unless there's a dispute of fact or law, the judge will try to conduct the case in an informal or non-adversarial atmosphere. If there is a dispute, then it may become more like a traditional adversarial court process. The judge will also create a black robe effect. Even though care proceedings take place in a civil court and emphasize self-determination, having a judge involved adds a weight and respect that can help motivate the respondents and encourage adherence to the care agreement or care plan. For more information, you can visit the legal roles in the CARE Act brief. So let's look over the roles and consider where you have additional questions or need additional clarification. Volunteer supporters can reach out to the case manager at the Behavioral Health Agency or email info@careact.org with questions you have about the different roles and what it could look like in your individual client's care process. So let's go over what the court flow looks like, and we're going to tie that in with a scenario about a client that's participating in the CARE Act and the different paths that this person may take in the process. So the CARE Act is about leveraging a system to help provide support, and we do not want to lose focus on helping an individual. We're going to be looking at this process through the lens of a specific respondent. Michael. And keep in mind, Michael's not one specific person. He's a conglomeration of people that may sound familiar, but we aren't referencing a specific individual. So let's take a look at Michael's background. He's 43 years old. He was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder at 18 and left home quickly thereafter. He's done a few jobs, but he's become homeless over time, and he's dropped out over school. He's had a close relationship with his parents, Brian and Sarah, in the past, but he's become less trusting of them. He's spent years in various homeless encampments and stays in the general area where he grew up. And his parents have done their best to keep track of him over time. So he's been hospitalized several times in his life, including twice in the last 60 days, but he's been discharged after a brief hold. And he learned that in order to be discharged, he would have to agree to take medication until he was back out on the street. So what's his current functioning? He often appears internally preoccupied, and he's been losing weight and sleeping through the day, not to the point where it's a medical emergency, but he's been losing weight and he seems to be sleeping more. And there's been times in his life where his behavior was so erratic, he was placed on a hold for grave disability. However, he's seldom at the hospital beyond 72 hours. And once he's medicated, his symptoms are stabilized and he's released with a prescription for antipsychotics, but he seldom fills that. He goes to the local soup kitchen daily for a meal and has a sleeping bag that he sleeps in at night. His parents sometimes go to the encampment to try to persuade him to move back to their home, and they fear for his safety, and he's been increasingly more paranoid. Michael yells at people at the encampment, and this has resulted in a few recent assaults from others who were there. And sometimes he will yell at the staff at the soup kitchen because he believes they mean him harm after the recent assaults. Michael has been using methamphetamines for the past 5 years, which exacerbates his psychotic symptoms. So Brian and Sarah, his parents, have contacted the homeless outreach team who work with people who are unhoused and living in the encampment. When they see Michael there, they attempt to engage him in treatment. However, he declines any help they offer him. So this is Michael. Keep Michael in mind as we move through this process. So, what is the supporter's role? So, before we jump into that court process, we wanted to share what the supporter's role is throughout. Although the supporter is not responsible for tracking hearing dates or documenting decisions, they may appreciate knowing what the process looks like and how to best help the respondent. So there are different roles that the supporter can play in each step of the care proceedings depending on the needs and preferences of the respondent. Consider such roles as helping the respondent prepare for a stressful situation, helping the respondent visualize the people and the setting in advance of the meeting or hearing, talking through options with the respondent, helping the respondent understand next step, ensuring that the respondent's needs and preferences are known and respected. The supporter should make a plan with the respondent on how they would like the supporter to participate, and this plan should be revisited with the respondent throughout the care process. So let's take a look at what Michael's journey may look like. So we want to refer to this overall process. And again, at first, this may seem complicated, so we want to break it down into the steps to understand Michael's journey and how his supporter could help him throughout the process. So we'll briefly touch base on what will happen during the referral or petition, and then discuss in slightly more detail the role of the supporter in the development of a care plan or agreement, service delivery, and potential next steps. But keep in mind that engagement with the respondent and the county can happen throughout this care process. So initiation and engagement. So unless the volunteer supporter is also the original petitioner that initiated this process, the initial petition happened before the supporter is involved. So this is the first step when an eligible petitioner asks the court through a petition to consider an individual's eligibility for the care process. It can also happen as a referral to County BH. So we talked through a number of the petitioners who could potentially take this step, but the petition should include information that helps the court to consider if the person is eligible. So let's talk about what engagement would look like. So during this next step after the initial petition, the court will decide if Michael, our respondent, meets the eligibility requirements to go through the care process. So with the prima facie determination, once the petition is filed, the court will decide if the petition has shown that Michael meets eligibility for care. So there would be what's called a prima facie determination, which just means that the first look impression is that the petition has demonstrated that Michael is or may be eligible for care proceedings. So if the original petitioner was someone other than the county agency, in our case, Michael's parents, Brian and Sarah, the county agency would be asked to file a report that determines whether Michael may meet eligibility criteria. So this report would include a determination if he meets the care criteria, the outcomes of efforts to engage Michael in services, and any conclusions and recommendations. So this would, while assessing for Michael's eligibility, a few questions could be asked about a qualifying diagnosis, if he appears to be at risk for not surviving safely in the community, if is his condition deteriorating, and would be the least restrictive alternative. And then what would happen next. So based off of the information, the court will review the report and determine next steps. So for the purposes of our flow, let's consider that Michael is found to be eligible and he's declined to engage voluntarily in services. At that point, he will move into the court process and service connection. And this is also when Michael will have the opportunity to select a supporter. And he selects his mother, Sarah. So let's take a closer look at that. We'll focus on the court process, which is when the respondent, in our case, Michael, keeping in mind that the supporter is not responsible for tracking these steps, but it can just be helpful to know and what will be happening, and so that the supporter and the respondent can discuss together how the supporter should be involved. So the initial appearance. This is the first time that the parties appear in court. Counsel for the respondent will have been appointed prior to this appearance, and the counsel will let the respondent know that they have the right to a supporter. The respondent, along with their chosen supporter, can choose to be at this court hearing, or they can allow their attorney to appear for them. The behavioral health agency will be substituted in as the petitioner if the petition was filed by another individual. So in Michael's case, Brian and Sarah, the original petitioners, are there along with Michael, his attorney, and the county behavioral health agency. The behavioral health agency will now take over as the petitioner in determining if Michael meets the care criteria. So as mentioned, there's also the potential for a volunteer supporter to be selected, and in Michael's case, that would be Sarah. The hearing on the merits is next, although it can happen at the same time as the initial appearance if everyone agrees. At the hearing on the merits, the court will determine if the respondent meets the care eligibility criteria, and if so, the court will order the behavioral health agency to work with the respondent and their counsel and supporter to engage in treatment and the development of a care agreement. At the prima facie stage discussed earlier, that is or may be standard, meaning it's much lower. The hearing on the merits requires a clear and convincing evidence standard to determine whether Michael meets the care criteria. If the court does not find that Michael meets a criteria, it will dismiss the case. In this scenario, the court finds that by clear and convincing evidence, Michael does meet the care criteria and needs to enter into a care agreement. So next, the court will order Michael, his attorney, county behavioral health, and his supporter to attempt to develop a care agreement. A care agreement is a voluntary agreement developed by the parties setting out a range of services and supports that would benefit the respondent or Michael. So a case management hearing is held within 14 days, and to determine whether a care agreement has been reached or if it's likely to be reached. There are two options. So if yes, the care agreement was reached, the care agreement will be solidified and the court can approve the settlement agreement or modify and approve it. The court will also set the care agreement for a progress hearing in 60 days. So if a care agreement was not reached, in this instance, Michael does not agree with the care agreement as he does not want to take medication and he's comfortable living outside in a homeless encampment. The court would order county behavioral health through a licensed mental health professional to conduct a clinical evaluation, which we'll talk about in a moment. So again, if they were not able to agree on the care agreement, the court will order a clinical evaluation. In this evaluation, the behavioral health agency will report to the court on the respondent's clinical diagnosis, whether the respondent has legal capacity to provide informed consent, and any additional information and recommendations for services and supports. The court will then review the clinical evaluation and other evidence presented. And if the court determines that the respondent continues to meet the care criteria, it will order the parties to jointly develop a care plan. So, like a care agreement, a care plan identifies a range of services and supports for the respondent, their attorney, the behavioral health agency, and the volunteer supporter will coordinate together to create a care plan. Ideally, they will agree on a plan to be proposed to the court, but if they can't agree, the behavioral health agency and the respondent may propose separate plans. The court will then consider and adopt the elements of the proposed care plans that best support the recovery and stability of the respondent and may issue orders necessary for the respondent to access those services. If the court finds that Michael lacks capacity to provide informed consent and the care plan can include medically necessary stabilization medication, unlike an involuntary medication order, this cannot be forcibly administered, only offered. Michael may be willing to talk to a psychiatrist and they can work together on a medication option. There is no penalty if Michael declines to take the medication. So once the care plan is ordered for 1 year, status review hearings will take place no less often than every 60 days. They can also happen more often than every 60 days. The status hearings are not just for the support people and the treatment providers to report on how Michael's doing. Michael can also say if there are services in his care plan that he is not getting and ask the court to enforce those services. There are three potential outcomes from the 1 year status review. One, Michael can request graduation. This means that Michael's doing well and he will work together with the county behavioral health agency to develop a graduation plan, including the services he will continue to engage in. Number two, Michael can request to voluntarily stay in care. The court may permit Michael's extension for up to 1 year. Reasons Michael may want to extend could include better access to services or the accountability and structure of care has been helpful for him. Or number three, the court orders involuntary continuation in care. Maybe Michael just started to engage towards the end of the year, so it appears it would benefit him to stay with the care plan. This extension may happen only for 1 year. It's important to remember that while Michael's care plan is court ordered, it is not a criminal court, meaning there are limits to what can happen to Michael if he doesn't want to participate, and there are no criminal consequences. He will not suddenly have a probation officer or something to that effect. The role of the supporter is vitally important when someone is not in initial agreement, but is clearly in need of services to help things from getting worse. Engaging with the client will require respecting Michael's autonomy and right to self-determination. On some levels, Michael knows what's best for him, but he may not have the insight to have the full picture of the direction he's going in. It's important to respect Michael's autonomy and at the same time encourage him to engage in psychosocial treatment, which will increase his chances at maintaining that autonomy. This is a complex process, but there are many opportunities to engage and allow for the impact of the black robe effect. There will be a lot of training available. Training in mental health illness is important. What do we know about the diagnosis that he has? What do we do about co-occurring disorders, and how do we work with him? On treatment options, what are the evidence-based treatment options that will most benefit Michael, and how do we talk to them about him? This will also take trauma-informed care. Motivational interviewing will be essential to respect Michael's wishes and work with him on some of these healthier options. This is essential for clients who are not in initial agreement to their care plan. If Michael declines to comply with or participate in a care agreement or plan, with the exception of not complying with the medication plan, the court can terminate his participation in the care process if Michael chooses not to participate. So, what are the consequences? If LPS proceedings occur within the next 6 months of the termination of the care plan, information regarding Michael's non-participation will be included to inform this process. The termination of a care plan doesn't automatically trigger LPS hearings. Information about non-adherence to medications cannot be included. If the services can continue, county behavioral health and community support providers can continue to outreach to Michael to offer treatment and other services and supports. This presentation has focused on the court process so that a volunteer supporter can feel prepared for their role in the process. We have also shared information about how the voluntary nature of the court proceedings. However, keep in mind that the care process is more than just about court hearings and legal proceedings. It's about the county and court working together to support the respondent. And while the respondent has the ability to refuse services, the county is obligated to provide them. As we reflect on the respondent's journey through the care process, consider what questions you have. Consider addressing these questions with the respondent's assigned case manager from the behavioral health team or the respondent's legal counsel. You can also consider submitting an email to ask questions about the care process. So as we wrap up this training, keep in mind the different objectives that we were aiming for. So the goal is that by the end of the session, participants, you would have an increased ability to describe the why behind the care act, distinguish some of the key roles, and describe the overall legal process. If you have email questions, please consider reviewing the materials on the careact.org or reaching out to info@careact.org. There are a number of resources and information to help you. These materials are linked in the training materials, so go ahead and click on that PDF, and you can click on these links and any links provided throughout this training.